delighted to introduce Kevin MacNeil, who's from the Outer Hebridean. This is his third novel, I think, is that correct?
I think so.
Brewed Forever. And I think I was really pleased to use this for our book club. So we're kind of looking for various books that connect to Scotland and different aspects of Scotland and Scottish identity and kind of cultural collisions. And I think as visitors to Scotland, I think it's a super opportunity to kind of meet an author who's kind of exploring some of these themes in his fiction. So, Kevin, thank you.
Thank you very much. Lock the door because I want to read all of these books and nobody gets out till I've finished all of them. I'll just give you a few seconds to acclimatise to the accent because I'm going to assume the part of the world that you come from, people don't speak exactly like this. So Kevin, thank you much for coming along. I thought that I'd like to keep this quite informal and quite interactive. So I thought I would begin. I'm not one of those writers who thinks everything is about me, because those writers do exist. But I might just use my sort of experience, just a springboard into talking about literature, culture, and I wanted to be quite sort of back and forth. So do think up some questions. No question too big or small or silly that I would have some kind of answer for it. And yeah, it's a pleasure for me to be back in Edinburgh because I began my writing life here in Edinburgh. I left home being an island off the northwest coast of Scotland. I left when I was quite young, quite naive, and I felt like I came to two universities. I came to the University of Edinburgh, aged, 17 or 18. But also I sort of realised, especially in retrospect, I was at the University of Life. I was learning as much outside of the classroom as I was in it. I came here to study English literature and Latin, and I took Scottish ethnology as my outside subject, thinking that I knew what one of those words meant. The first thing I learned was I didn't know what either of those words meant, really. But it was important to me. I ended up doing my honours degree in ethnology for two reasons. One being that it's such a wide open subject, it's very useful to a writer. And secondly, it made me feel like for the first time in my life, that the people, culture, and place that I come from had legitimacy, validity, and that actually existed. Because I went through school and watching TV and listening to radio and so forth, not quite sure that my people really existed, because we were so marginalised, and to some extent still are. And I think it's partly because of that, living on a kind of place that kind of exists, but sometimes gets left off the map. And also living in a really insular environment, I felt the urge to escape when I was growing up. And it was that need for escapism, which I think made me so interested in literature. So I read a lot. I did a lot of sport as well. But reading was my sort of way of learning about the wider world. We can talk maybe a bit more later about the cultural background, specific to places like Lewis, where, for example, on the Sunday, the Sabbath, playing football, hanging your washing out, going to the swing park to play on a Sunday was not really culturally acceptable. So you had to find other means of entertainment. Were we allowed entertainment on a Sunday? Well, at any rate, I found entertainment through reading. But I had no confidence, none whatsoever. I came to university and I started getting to know more people and getting to enjoy Edinburgh as a city and a place of, to me, great literary heritage, as I'm sure you're finding out for yourselves. And it's still my favourite city in the world. And Edinburgh really gave me a new dimension in life. And I still had no self-esteem, no confidence, nothing. But somehow I thought that I should at least be writing a serious try. So I started writing poems. And in those days, I only wrote poetry. I thought that's all I would do, just write poetry. And I started to feel like maybe there's something in what I was writing. At one point, I took a big bundle of poems, maybe about 40 poems. I'm using the word poems very loosely here. To the writing residence at the university here. And he was halfway up David Hume Tower. He had an office. His name was Andrew Gregg. He's a terrific writer, a poet, a life writer, novelist, very good writer. And I was too shy to see him. So I left this bunch of poems at his door with a covering letter and my address. And he read the poems and he wrote back to me and he said, "Dear Kevin, I've read these poems. They are an intriguing combination of real, original talent and cloudy nothingness." Come and see me. So I went to the David Hume Tower, and I began seeing Andrew regularly with poems, and he was very critical. I think he sensed in me, although I was quite a shy kind of person, I had the kind of tenacity that you either have or don't have. That's the thing nobody can give you. All the other stuff you've got or you can develop. And if any of you are interested in becoming a writer, if I can do it, you can. There's nothing special in me. It's more transferable skills, communication skills, which you use every single day, whether you're speaking or not, and an imagination, which you use every single night and probably most days when you're dreaming. Your imagination is working without you even trying. So that's evidence that you're inherently creative without even trying. Slightly jumping ahead of myself, because Andrew Gregg started teaching me the skills. Like, he really criticised my work quite sharply, because he knew I could take it, because I was very serious about my writing. Even serious to the point where when I'm sitting down on a chair, 8 floors up in the David Hume Tower, across whichever direction it is, Andrew Gregg would be sitting on the windowsill telling me about maybe John Berman or Lord Lowell or somebody, a tiny bit of poetry. And he would be dwarfed, but still I was too focused on the poetry to find that interesting. I learned a lot from him, and I started getting more published. So I was probably about 20 when I first started publishing work. And I thought I might read a poem for you in Gaelic, because do any of you speak Gaelic? You've heard them much though. Do you like to hear a poem, and would you like to hear a poem in Gaelic? The great thing with Gaelic is you can write a shopping list in Gaelic and it sounds like a poem. I might even read a shopping list, you never know. It's a very inherently musical language. It's lifting. It's like, people describe it being like the sea. It's up and down. And this poem it's a love poem, and it's kind of about the sea. I guarantee you're going to learn at least one Gaelic word in this poem. See if you can spot them. It's called Fachlin Eichwarer, which means words, seahorses. Na myfrydar va mi'n rhaid mare. As yw hen nid ych yn traum. Ligol dochyd mare. Agus dach yn gyl soch yn ymych chlwysyn. In ras te richt. Oroch grain anu. Mae'n iechfar notig yn masje. Saxophonic yn bigge lodrug. You must have caught at least one in there. So in English, because I will read it in English, and it doesn't look quite fair only to read it in Gaelic. This is an English version, words, seahorses. I dreamt I was the seafloor, and you were the weight of the ocean pressing down on me. Your quiet words of love in my ears now and again, golden, elegant, and strange, like seahorses, like grace notes, tiny, floating saxophones. Do you know what the word is for that literary technique where you take things of a similar shape? For example, is this a close-up seahorse or a faraway saxophone? Do you know what the technique is when you have repeating shapes? There's a poet by Ian Crichton Smith, who was a poet 1928 to 1998, he lived, from my home island. And he has a poem where round, sort of John Lennon-style glasses become, without drawing attention, that's an image, and then a few months later, there's an image of a double-barreled shotgun, and then 2 bicycle wheels. It's very, very subtle, but it's there if you look for it. Shapes repeat. Do you know what that's called? It's called being a smartass. It's a bit geek. The reason I read that poem is partly because it's one of the poems I still like, partly because it's in Gaelic, and partly because at this point in my career, I felt like I had begun to get rid of the cloudy nothingness that had been in my early writings. And I see it in a lot of aspiring writers. I pass on writing skills as often as I can. And rooting ideas and big emotions and angst and all the rest of it into convincing, evocative poems means using tangible images and so on. It's not enough to say, I'm sad or I'm in love. You've got to prove it and demonstrate it. Robert Frost said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. You've got to evoke those emotions. It's not about telling people that you're sad. That's not a very good point. But Andrew helped me to do that. I was very lucky because a publisher approached me asking me for a manuscript. And that came about because I was awarded really quite a significant amount of money for what was then called the Scottish Arts Council. And I couldn't believe it because it was really quite a lot of money. But when money comes and goes, the fact that if you win something like that, it's always on your CV, it really meant a lot to me that these people rated my work enough to do that. And a woman who was on that panel that awarded me the Financial Writers Award was a senior editor at Canongate Books and asked me for a manuscript, and that just doesn't happen. People ask me, how did you publish? Well, I was in the right place at the right time, and you can't really engineer that, other than perhaps along the lines of that old phrase, the harder you work, the more luck you have. And I did work hard, and I didn't let rejections along the way bother me too much. I learned how to accept these things later in life. But anyway, that manuscript then I sent to them, and that became my first book, Love in the Outer Hebrides, which is still in print, which is kind of amazing because it still says. I'm genuinely not going to read all of these. In fact, I've just realised two are the same, except that's the cheap version. It didn't colour and cover yet. And then I'm kind of missing out some of the hardships along the way and making it sound a bit easier than it was. But then what happened? Then I was invited to be writing residence for the Highlands area of Scotland. So I had a little office in Portree on the Isle of Skye, which I believe some of you have been to Skye. And I just drive around the Highlands teaching writing workshops, appraising manuscripts, and doing it with my own writing. And I tried, because I realised at one point during this residency, I was paid to spend half my time encouraging other people and half my time doing my own writing. But I was actually spending longer than full-time hours helping others. And so I said to myself, you're not a writing residence, you're just in residence. Do some writing. So I tried to write a book within 24 hours, and I failed. It took 48, but I wrote this book. It's called Be Wise, Be Otherwise. And the subtitle is Ideas and Advice for Your Kind of Person. It's quite an offbeat book. It's kind of little bits of advice, which are either very serious, or very tongue-in-cheek, or you just don't know. Like, because there was a craze when this came out for these kind of little book of calm style books. So this was my kind of version of that, but written in 2 days. Collect driftwood, make art pieces, throw them back. I used to do that when I lived in Skye. There are so many people in the world that the chances of someone breathing in absolute unison with you right now are very high indeed. Feel synchronized. Mime your innocence to a CCTV camera. You can take a seahorse to water. So I did that for 3 years, and then I had the honour immediately after that of going to. Are any of you in Sweden by any chance? Great place. I was invited over to be writing resident at Uppsala University in Sweden, which is wonderful. I highly recommend Sweden for studying, living, or working. It's wonderful. And I realise I'm speaking a little bit more about myself than I intended to, so fast forward to the next years. Somehow, having begun my writing life as a poet, I moved into novels. So I wrote a novel called The Stornoway, which is a dark, funny, but quite a dark novel. A bit controversial, sold well. Still don't know if I was crazy or brave to write it, but I did. And then, I think around about then, I was paid to go live in a palace for a year in Germany. A bit bizarre. So I did that. Came back to Scotland. Decided that the thing to do was go and live in a cottage. Having lived in a palace in Germany, naturally I wanted to live in a freezing cold little cottage in a remote part of Shetland, where I used to go outside in a storm to warm up. And I was just, I kind of not really exaggerating. The late great poet Adrian Mitchell, whose work I very, very highly recommend, He used to say that the heated towel rack in the bathroom was the only source of warmth in that house. And I was describing the house to a guy I knew in Shetland, and he was an electrician, and he said, "Oh yeah, I worked in that house once. There was ice outside the freezer in the kitchen." I was like, "Yes, that's the one." I did that for a year, and I wrote another novel, which I set in Edinburgh, called A Method Actor's Guide to Jekyll and Hyde. It was a kind of modern answer, not a version of, but a kind of modern way of looking at Robert Louis Stevenson's amazing book, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which although it's ostensibly set in London, if you've read the novel, it's a novella really, and you've spent any time at all in Edinburgh, you realise that actually it's set in Edinburgh, because Edinburgh is divided in a Jekyll and Hyde, Old Town and New Town, and so forth. And I'm a huge fan of Robert Louis Stevenson. So I wrote a kind of modern book looking at some of those themes, and also slightly updating some elements of that book, because the story of Jekyll and Hyde, it's become archetypal. It's the third most filmed story of all time, because it really speaks to us. But most people know the film version rather than the book version, because there are certain issues, like for example, a bit like Shakespeare's Tempest, it's quite hard to offer a feminist reading of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because there are no significant female characters. Kind of interesting things like that. So I thought it was time to look at aspects of that narrative and think about duality and identity. And I was drawing parallels in that bit between creating characters and inviting people to believe in them as an author, and creating characters the way that method actors do, really trying to make people believe in something which isn't necessarily true, but inviting them into the illusion. Which brings me to The Brilliant and Forever, which is a novel where, again, I have a number of, I think, things that I really believe in that I wanted to say or underline, but my general attitude towards novel writing is, I always quote Salvador Dali, who said, "Art is a lie that tells the truth." I come strongly to believe that novels are fictions which reveal bigger truths. Novels are fictions which reveal bigger truths. And that's why I feel compelled to be a writer. Is I think if you've got something worth saying and sharing, it might as well be meaningful. And it's the books which have meaning that are more likely to last. And that's why we read Shakespeare for our literature. There's meaning in there. It's not merely the eloquence and amazing psychology, it's the underlying meanings. There's a kind of overview of my career. But what I would like to do, because I'm not here just to talk about me, I'd like to know a bit about your background, any questions or comments you have about the writing life or advice. If any, I'm going to assume some of you are interested in creative writing. If you have any questions along those lines, being published, how things are changing in that world. I will also take questions about my own work, of course, if you want to talk about that, but I'm quite happy to talk about writers other than the one sitting in front of you. Any comments? Anybody want to share any ideas about literature or want to ask any questions? Yeah.
I do have a question. So I've recently been studying poetry, and that's what I did as like my concentration. But I love prose. I just find it very hard to shift from writing poetry, which is, it can be very brief and it's quicker to write, and then into the long series of fiction and prose, and keeping my attention on any one piece. I didn't know, how did that transition go for you? Like, how did you work through that? Maybe what like techniques you had, or keeping yourself so centered as you did start with poetry?
That's a really good question. You might end up becoming a novelist too, it might not just be poetry for you. I think you're in a very strong position. It happened with me quite unintentionally, and I guess fairly naturally, but I've always maintained that if you begin writing like a poet, that sets you up for doing all kinds of writing, with the possible exception of dialogue, but because we don't speak in prose. But dialogue actually is relatively easy if you understand the functions of dialogue, of which there are 5. I'll talk about that later But the concentration, the intensity, the learning how to read craft language will stand you in good stead. I mean, I'm a relatively slow novelist because I like to craft the sentences. Those same techniques, if you apply them to prose, but don't forget pace as well. You're in a really strong position. I think it's not a natural movement for everyone to go from poetry to prose. Some people think you've defected. You can still write both. You can write a poetic prose. You can write prose poems. Experiment and have fun with it. I mean, I think the skill set that you already have as a poet is a wonderful, wonderful thing to carry over into prose. The structure might be different, but if you learn how to adopt methods of structured thinking, for example, if you can follow the rules of or conventions of sonnet writing or haiku writing, then you can look at a structure and follow that. You do have quite a lot of freedom as a novelist. You have slightly less freedom as a playwright, but there are still structures, narrative structure, and less freedom still as a screenwriter, which is something I've been doing lately as well. The more money is involved in something, the more you're kind of writing for committee. And this actor says, "Oh no, my character wouldn't say that." What do you mean my character? It's my character. Actually, no, it's everybody's character. It's going to be public, so let's not be too precious. I think you're in a strong position if you're a poet moving towards prose. One of the reasons I say that is the way I write, whether I'm writing prose, poetry, or whatever I'm writing, I like to write not as though I'm being paid by the word, but as though I'm paying for every word. And then I really do keep it condensed, and that's one of the great skills. Don't be careful of overwriting. That's something I sometimes see as a potential pitfall in poets moving into prose. They overwrite, and the narrative momentum sometimes can slacken. So that's a pitfall. But poetry into prose, yeah, big thing. Advantages of being a poet are when you're in readings, you can read the whole poem, beginning to end, people get it or they don't. They can go and reread it. But if you read from a novel, you've got to contextualize things or else read the beginning and you can't give a full flavour. Also, there's loads of poetry festivals, so you start getting invited to these all around the world, which is nice. Advantages of writing novels. It's quite satisfying to write any book, but a novel, it just feels like, yeah, I wasn't quite sure I would ever do it, but I did. And there's more money in it than in poetry. Although if you're doing any of these things for money, you're probably doing it for the wrong reasons. Mm-hmm. It's a plain idea. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yeah.
How did you balance writing while you were in school?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I mean, when I was here, I have to confess, I spent quite a lot of time in the pub, but I spent a great deal of time in the library in John Square. And I read everything. I read voraciously, I read widely, I read deeply. And it's what I call creative reading. A free way to learn how to write is when you read a book or read a passage and it has a physical effect on you, like you get really angry or you love it. You know, you have some kind of, you get palpitation, or you can't stop reading. Pause and ask yourself what techniques that writer is using to make you feel that way. Learn from. Slow down your reading. Ask yourself, why is this so effective? And if you read something that really doesn't work, same thing. Learn what mistake that author is making, in your opinion, and don't repeat it in your work. And be aware of what's going on around you. I mean, one of the wonderful things about traveling and studying in a new country or a new city is your senses are heightened because everything's quite new. You're a bit more alert and you're more wary of cultural differences. You know, am I counting my money correctly? Am I doing the right thing here? Is this a bit of a social faux pas? You're kind of more aware of things. You know this, if you travel and if you're in a new place, it enlivens the mind. So being aware and alert to what's going on, relaxed but alert, all of these things will feed happily and productively into your writing. So it's not just a case of being alert when you're reading, but actually when you're reading life and reading other people in the streets, reading people is one of the people watching. It's one of the most amazing things about being a writer is that you're kind of getting paid to do that. very satisfying. But I just spend a lot of time in the library. And with friends. I mean, you've got to have a social life too. Yeah, I read it a lot.
You still write in Gaelic at all? Or?
I do, but maybe not as much as I would like to. I don't interact with people in Gaelic as much as I would like to. I've been living in London for the last 6 years. I'm going to move away this year, actually. I don't know where, but I'm going to move away from London. Maybe back here, sometime, but before the end of the year. There are people whom I think never spoken to in English, and I love the language, and there's all kinds of reasons why I want to support it. But I guess it should come down to things like this. But I slightly worry that the readership is quite small, but that's no excuse. I mean, I have written quite a few different things for radio and stage and screen in Gaelic. And sometimes the poems I wrote in Gaelic because they sort of had to be Gaelic. It wasn't necessarily an overtly conscious choice. One thing I would do again is, I was commissioned a few years ago to write a play for young people who would normally go to the cinema but wouldn't really go to the theatre. They would go to the pub maybe if they were old enough, or if they weren't. So I wrote this comic play for people in the Highlands and Islands. And part of the funding involved something like, okay, I'll make it ridiculous, 39.6% of the play had to be in Gaelic. But I had a problem here because I knew that the larger percentage of the audience would not be Gaelic speaking. So how do you get over that without repetition, which isn't fair to those people in the audience who have Gaelic, but without the non-Gaelic speakers missing plot point or aspects of character? And it was quite a difficult thing to do. I got around it by using quite a bit of song and poetry, which it doesn't really have translated, it just is itself. But I kind of vowed to be wary of doing that again in the future. It also felt a bit tokenistic rather than arising naturally, whereas with the poems and various things that I've written in Gaelic, they've generally been organically in Gaelic, although I've also had commissions where they were for write this in Gaelic, and so I wrote in Gaelic. But I had quite an interesting experience late last year or this year where I co-wrote a documentary film about a really interesting Scottish cultural figure called Hamish Henderson. And he was an incredible human being. It's quicker to list the things he didn't do than things he did, but he was very much involved in World War II. He was a songwriter and a poet. As a songwriter, he wrote songs. He was in the North African and Sicilian campaigns and so forth. He wrote songs over there that precede him back to Scotland. So he'd back to Scotland and he would hear people singing these songs at parties as if they're traditional songs, not realizing the guy who wrote them was in that room. And he loved this. He was also a great poet. His one and only poetry collection won the inaugural Somerset Maugham Award. So as well as writing folk songs, often for the people, he was also writing what might be seen as more kind of elitist or rarefied poetry. He was a folk song collector and ethologist, and he was instrumental in founding what was called the School of Scottish Studies here in George Square, and is now, I think, part of the Celtic and what is it? It's got a new title anyway. It was an incredible archives, and those of you who are American and have heard of Alan Lomax, he was a great ethnomusicologist, I guess you would call him. He was a friend of Hamish's, and Hamish took him around collecting songs in Scotland, and Hamish did a lot of that himself. And the archives at the School of Scottish Studies, or whatever it's called nowadays, are a testament to that. He was also a political figure, cultural figure, a very complicated man. I love how Scottishly contradictory everything about Hamish is. He was a pacifist who went to war. He was a folk songwriter who wrote quite high-level kind of poetry. He was a bisexual man who was married with a family, and they're in the documentary, which was wonderful. And he was an academic who never wrote an academic book. He was a nationalist, but he was also quite seriously left-wing. Just massive contradictions. He wrote, among his many songs, The Freedom Call, which is often presented as the song that, in some people's mind, ought to be the Scottish national anthem. So that's one of his claims to fame. But the reason I mention that is the linguistic issue. That film is in Gaelic, German, Italian, English. I can't remember if there are any other languages. But kind of made me feel quite proud to see Gaelic taking its place among all these other languages, as it rightly should, because it was once spoken in many parts, not all of Scotland, but many parts of Scotland. But it was actively discouraged, and when my father went to school, for example, he couldn't speak English. Gaelic is his first language, but from his first day in school, he was taught through the medium of English. It's crazy. That's my little bit about the oppression of minority languages.
My first exposure to Gaelic in Scottish literature was Whiskey Law.
Uh-huh.
And I thought it was kind of very clever how in a comic novel he managed to incorporate Gaelic into the humour and the life of the island. So yeah, I kind of enjoyed that. I didn't think song was a kind of more accessible medium to access Gaelic as like hearing a language put to music, the meaning becomes less important in a way.
Yeah.
Through that.
I mean, I edited a book called The Islands We Sing about 5 years ago, and because I looked around and I realised how many amazing poets lived on the Scottish Islands, regardless of whether they were born and raised there or moved there and made their home there. And it just seemed that the islands are so rich in poetry, and that book was a testament. There's so many good poets in there. I mean, labour of love, it was a pleasure to do. And I began wondering why it is that the islands have given us so many amazing poets, not just in Gaelic and English in the Outer Hebrides, but also up in Shetland and Orkney. And I think the reason is because in these traditions, there was no distinction made between song and poetry. And poems were sung every day as part of the rich work life that they had. So people were rowing a boat, they had a rowing song. Everything that was rhythmic or monotonous, that could be lighten the load with a song, they would do that. Making tweed, which was, it was less maybe gender aware. This was the women's job. Women worked very, very hard to make Harris tweed. They were called walking the tweed, Waulking. And it was this kind of rhythmic action, and the women had great poems and songs, often making fun of people in the local community, pairing up young women with young men and all the rest of it. But poetry was part of everyday life. It was part of everyday life. Most of the tasks that had a kind of repetitive nature, there were songs to lighten that load. And I think that's kind of amazing. It's kind of a shame that we've lost that, and poetry nowadays is more, I suppose, more personal and less community orientated. But that's just the ongoing nature of changes in society. Any other questions, comments? Yeah.
You mentioned being pretty self-conscious about your writing when you first started. So I was wondering what process or what really kind of helped you become comfortable with just submitting your poems places, writing and sending it to places?
Well, partly I think it genuinely becomes easier with experience. So I think there's a couple of things I want to say there, trying to pass on advice and also with a hint of don't make mistakes that I made. One of the things that I've come to learn is, I see this in aspiring writers, they get upset if somebody critiques a piece of writing and they go, oh, so-and-so doesn't like me. And hold on, they criticised your poem, they didn't say anything about you. You're taking it personally because you're over-identifying with a piece of work, whereas maybe their intentions were good. Maybe they weren't, but the realisation hit me at some point that if you're going to have a sizable readership at all, and I hope all of you will. It's not a case of some people might not like your work. It's a fact that some people will not like your work. I know that's a shocking thing to say, but the sooner you sort of realise that, the healthier it is. And the reason for that is actually not a bad reason, it's just humanity being what it is. There are people who don't like pizza. I find that astonishing, but there are. It's human nature. We're diverse. There are people who don't like curry. That's weird to me. But I don't think any less of a person if they don't like curry. It's just that our tastes are different. So it's at this point I always like to quote a sign hanging in the toilet of the Thai restaurant in Stornoway where I grew up. I didn't grow up in a toilet, but I grew up. There's a sign hanging there, and I always love it because it's quite inspiring to begin with. It says, "To make the best meal in the world is actually possible." Wow, that's pretty profound. But then underneath it, "To make everyone enjoy it is impossible." That's even more profound. So you can write the best book of your abilities. You can write the best book ever, but there will be people who don't like it. Look up your favourite novel online, look up reviews, there will be people who didn't get it. Look up your favourite film on IMDb, it won't have 100% rating. It's human nature. And some of the people who don't like it or don't get it are willfully not liking it or getting it because of their own issues, maybe pet envies or sibling rivalries. Yes, I'm afraid things exist in the world of literature. But you need to be involved, you acknowledge those things and not be affected by it. So I've learned to do that, to understand that it's not feasible to expect everybody to love your book.
Well, that's a beautiful introduction to the Brenton Forever, which in a way, I see as part of its meaning is it's a literary criticism.
Yeah.
It's structured around the book festival. It's presented as a series of stories, and I think you're right in that. It's a really interesting disassociation from the authors presenting fiction to be criticised within a narrative structure. So yeah, is that a way of kind of responding to criticism in a way? To write a book about literary criticism?
It was, yeah. And I mean, I had some serious things to say in this book, and so that's one of the reasons I used humour, because I think it's quite an effective way of making serious points. All my books are completely different to each other, like, as if they weren't written by the same person. But if anything that runs through them, it's probably humour. But one of the serious points I wanted to make in the novel is that we another part of our human nature is to kind of judge people. When we see somebody, walk by them in the street, meet them for the first time, naturally, without thinking about it, quicker than thought, we make judgments about who that person is. But I contend that people are far more interesting in our lives than we necessarily give them credit for. So, if you meet somebody, you might have some sort of glancing impression of who they are. But if that person then shares with you a poem they wrote, a song they wrote, a painting they did, they're sort of giving you a privileged insight into a deeper essence of who they are. And you'll bond with them more, or understand them more, and have better insight into who they are. And for that reason, the character and the stories that they present in this festival are probably not, and I think hopefully not, the kind of stories that you would immediately associate that they would create. And I think that's true to life. That's an aspect of being a lie that tells the truth, because it is fiction, but actually that's one of the truths that I wanted to reveal and demonstrate. Not just tell, but demonstrate. But also some of it relates back to the question that you had. I should really have asked everyone's names, where everyone's from. I think I might still do that. I wasn't sure of the etiquette of that when I do webcast. One of the other things I learned about becoming more experienced and more comfortable as a writer is I used to get really nervous doing readings, doing events like this. I read to, I think, 9,000 live people as opposed to zombies. Not that we're zombies. 9,000 of a live audience, regardless of TV or radio, but 9,000 was the largest audience. And that was quite nerve-wracking. But reaching very small audiences can be nerve-wracking too. But I learned, after a certain point, I learned how not to let that faze me. It's partly because I realised that getting drunk or something before a reading is actually quite counterproductive, and it's boring for the audience. It's just not. It's predictable. It's stereotypical. It's not very fair because invariably the author is enjoying it more than the audience, which doesn't seem like the deal. And I realised that actually, if you do get nervous, I'm a huge advocate of physical exercise. And one day I realised that a lot of the physical sensations of getting nervous before doing a big event, palpitations, sweating, kind of getting spikes of adrenaline, all of these happen quite naturally if you do physical exercise. They feel unnatural because you haven't done physical exercise. So I often, like if after a reading, I don't even get worried about doing events anymore. I don't even feel like I necessarily have to do this now. But if I was feeling in any way worried, or I don't really, if I had any anxiety about doing an event, I would do some really hardcore bike riding or running beforehand, then grab a shower, then go and do the event. Because then if your heart rate is stopped, it just feels normal because you've been exercise. And it's a really simple way of getting over any kind of stage fright, butterflies, nerves. And I think it works. I think I might have mentioned it in here. Probably putting a lot of tongue-in-cheek stuff in a book because people sometimes aren't sure what's serious or not. Like haiku. I read this thing called haikukery. And I thought people should take that up. It's quite good fun. And they just think it's kind of gimmickry or flippancy, but it's not really.
He does go for a cycle ride.
He does go for a bike ride. Yeah, there's a wee bit of promotion of cycling. I did that in my last novel as well. I really believe that.
But it's kind of returning to the point about poetry, becoming a poet, turns into a writer. I thought there's a real, I don't want to say kind of density to your writing, but normally when I pick up a book, I can read it fairly quickly. Certainly with your novel here, you've got to go slowly. You've got like slow cooking. You've got to read it. There is, you can really see the care that's going into the language, and that makes you as a reader have to work quite hard to go through it. But I enjoyed that. I thought that was really something different. I think that's something to think about the poet who becomes a novelist. It's that care. And
I think it probably emerges from that. I mean, I kind of work hard over every sentence and make every word count. And I write quite a layer fiction, so again, like a poem, second reading, a different kind of idea of what it means can emerge. I've often that, especially with the last two novels, they are very layered. I wanted to write the kind of novel that words really. I think it's kind of good value to do that, but it does make the writing very, very time-consuming and difficult.
I think it slows down the reader, so you kind of enjoy it more. But something, one of the striking passages was the description of Edinburgh. I thought that was kind of one of the first passages that. Actually, my wife was reading it, and she said, read this description of Edinburgh. And I picked it up and then kind of read that. It was, that was perhaps poetic prose or prose poetry.
Well, I think what I was doing there was, I don't know if you've do I assume you've read the novel?
Mix, probably.
There's a character in the novel called Peter Projectorhead, and he's got a projector which projects physical images of all his thoughts all the time, and he's quite a tragic character actually, because he's got a very, very restless mind. He cannot slow down. He cannot be absolutely alive in the moment. And his thoughts are flickering back and forth between memories, fantasies, nostalgia, any crazy stuff, any human being's thoughts, but without ever slowing down or pausing or having moments of absolutely being in the moment. So his story in this competition is just an absolute brain of images flying through aspects of Edinburgh, and it's quite a pacey piece. But yeah, he is basically, that character is the opposite of being absolutely alive in the moment and grounded and centered and focused. He can't be that way, and I think he's quite a tragic character actually. I feel really quite sorry for him because of that. what I'm often doing in these novels is I'm taking aspects of reality and slightly exaggerating them to an almost absurd or sometimes a genuinely absurd degree to point up meaningful things in people's lives. I mean, I genuinely write with a view, especially nowadays, but I always have, even more so, more consciously nowadays, to give the reader something to take away in their own lives. That's what I try to do. That's what I endeavour to. So that writing isn't mere egotism or, I think the Scottish poet Kenneth White once referred to a kind of poetry that's verbal tiddlywinks. You know, I don't want to indulge in that. I want to write something that's got use, something that has benefit in people's lives and gives them something to think about and different ways of looking at experience itself and how the mind works. I'm just wondering if I should, I wasn't sure people know anything about the book or not. So, well, I should explain then. The Brilliant and Forever is, it takes place on an island in a kind of magical realist world where everybody is a writer as well as their day job. So when people meet each other, the question isn't, how are you? It's, what are you working on? And the big highlight of the year, every year on this island, is the Brilliant and Forever Festival. And what happens is everybody puts forward a short story, and the top short stories are chosen. And on Midsummer's Day, the whole island gathers, and the top writers, of whom there are about 13, read a story. And everybody's very patient, and there's judges, and a prize, publishing deal, and so forth for the winner, and a prize that's less pleasant for the loser. And, oh yeah, did I mention one of the main characters is a talking alpaca? Because he is Archie the alpaca. So alpacas are an oppressed species on this island. And this is the first time in 40 years an alpaca has a story in the Brilliant and Forever competition. And he's fighting prejudice and so forth, Archie. He's quite a colourful character. It was great fun to write. In fact, the book was fun to write. And so each of these, I think 13 characters, 12 human, 1 alpaca, perform a story on stage on Midsummer's Day. So within the novel, there's actually a short story collection. And we meet some of these characters before they present their stories. And the idea is, as I mentioned earlier, they don't necessarily perform stories that you would have expected them to, because that's true to life. If all of you wrote a story and let me read it, I would probably be pleasantly surprised at what you create. And I published some of those short stories in various books and magazines while I was writing the manuscript, just to test them to see if they'd stand alone. But I wrote them with characters specifically in mind, human or alpaca.
Was that awful disassociation between the writer and character writing the story?
I mean, it's something that intrigues me, you know, I mean, how people are inside themselves, how people view themselves, and the self that they present to the outside world, and self that is released when they engage with no thought of anything, no thought of the outside world, when people engage with art of whatever kind, and put something really from the heart and mind onto the page or canvas. It can be quite amazing what comes out. And that dimension of what a person is, who an alpaca is, kind of intrigues me, partly with the novel's rights. I think it's quite a sort of, hopefully quite a humane way of looking at us as sentient beings, but it's also partly about looking at how the mind works and how creativity works. And it's also partly about how and why we tell stories. Why do we retain the stories that we do? Because everything's narrative. Your perception of yourself is narrative. Edited, sometimes very heavily edited, because you don't remember everything that you have experienced, and some of it you don't want to remember. So, who are you really? Is one of the questions that's been asked, I think, in my last 2 novels.
What made you pick alpacas above any other animals?
Okay. Well, I wanted to write a novel that had talking animal, partly because of this idea of acknowledging at the very beginning, this is a lie that tells the truth. And I relished the challenge of saying to a reader, come with me on this. I'm going to have you believe in an alpaca if I can. And having to work how to make his character come across part of it. But why alpaca? I wanted to have a speaking animal, and partly because I was mindful of there's a literary tradition of writing serious fiction with talking animals, everything from Aesop's fables to George Orwell's Animal Farm. So it wasn't for flippantry, I had genuine reasons. And I was on a train in England trying to decide, and I was going through the animals. Cats and dogs, too easy, been done. Not too easy, just too obvious. Sheep, too obvious. Inviting all kinds of unsavory comments from the critics. I was winning that. Parrot, again, too obvious. I was going to visit some friends in a little village called Stony Stratford near Milton Keynes, and there was a festival on in the village that day. Kind of family thing with food stalls and this and then a guy there with a flock of alpacas, and one of them started speaking to me, didn't read. Flock of alpacas, and I looked at the alpacas and I saw how the character for these creatures looked, and I thought, it's got to be alpacas. It's got to be alpacas. And I also thought, surely there hasn't been a novel with talking alpacas. If there are novels, with talking alpacas, then if there's ever an anthology of fiction with talking alpacas, I'll be so hurt of at least some excerpt. And it turned out to be really good fun to create this alpaca character, this whole world of alpacas, and see how the critics respond to what the alpacas represent. They're oppressed, and it's about oppression, but I was kind of eager to see how critics would react to how they would interpret alpacas. And yeah, it was so much fun to do. I think it was the most fun book of mine that I wrote, and I took that as a very good sign when I was writing it. I really enjoyed writing it. And I think if you really enjoy doing something artistic, then whatever happens, the endeavour was worthwhile, and it's more likely to be successful as a book if it was fun to write, and it has proved really successful. I have to say I'm a bit pleasantly surprised that there was an appetite for talking alpaca literary fiction set on strange islands where everyone's a writer. Who would have thought? Maybe one day there'll be a section of Waterstones bookstores with talking alpaca into your literary festival books.
I read a story to my son the other day called Is My Mama a Llama? So I guess that's quite famous, but it's a nice exploration for children who are given some the creatures like their mamas. But there's one story that I think might be of particular interest to our group here, and that's the American teenager. I thought that was so teenage girl. That was quite so. I don't know. Do you want to talk about how you kind of got into that mind?
Yeah.
In terms of both her character and the story she presents.
Yeah, so there's a character called Summer Kelly, and she writes one of her story called I'm Your Inner Goddess, Dumbass. And it was great fun to write. So the first paragraph reads, Seek thine inner goddess, the book said. What it neglected to mention was that my inner goddess is a 4 foot tall, 3-eyed, crow-faced, Tibetan, orange-eyebrow deity named Acacia. So this girl and another girl, they're students at New Haven, and they go on holiday on vacation, I'd say, to Montana, and they buy a strange old. They realise that the place they've gone to on vacation is much smaller than they thought, but there's a strange little second-hand sort of store in this village, small town, and they buy an old book, among other things, and at night they're sitting drinking wine together. Riley and Sam, and they're getting drunk, and they realise that this book is written in all earnestness by a woman who claims that she went hiking through Tibet and Nepal, and she met some mystical dude and blah blah blah, and here are some chants that can sum your inner goddess, and they're just drunk enough that they think, what the hell, it's like, a Ouija board or something. They just think it'll be fun, no harm done. They think. So they summon this god, this strange little creature, something out of the muds, and this creature asks them to assassinate the Dalai Lama. And I mean, if there's anything bad for your karma, it's assassinating the Dalai Lama. So their quandary is, well should we do that? And the creatures tend to say, well, you're not really killing him, you're just promoting him up to another level. People like a computer game, no, I still got some moral quandary here. So that's one of the stories within the novel. Then I've got part of the fun of writing it was that tone of story is that story, but there are other stories which are written like prose poems, others which are very short, some which you might be reading thinking, well, that's surely the story that's going to win the competition. It's quite a big group friendly in that regard. And ultimately it's about how the publishing world negotiates the idea of what quality literature is nowadays, which is quite an interesting thing because it doesn't always necessarily equate with what you regard as being the kind of book that you like to read. Does that make sense? So there's a lot of humour in the book, but all of the humour is towards a serious kind of point. Towards the end, I might read a little bit about this as well, because this is kind of looking at why people write and why tell stories at all. And this is the narrator thinking about what the blank page is and why do we get scared sometimes when we sit down in front of a blank page. I think the blank page terrifies us, being the visual counterpart to silence. The blank page is an iced over graveyard, the absolute zero of all contact and warmth. The blank page renders us painfully vulnerable. The blank page says to us, show me the essence, show me what matters and why it matters. Blank page entreats us to prove we have been alive. So that's in a more serious kind of aspect of what writing is about. This kind of relates to what I was saying earlier about how easy it is to read a poem and you've got it, but there's so many different things going on in the book, often with humour, yeah. Here's a little exchange. I'll just read a couple of really, really short snippets just to get different flavours. Appetizer. This is my comment on social media, I guess. Archie the alpaca was distracted, checking emails on his phone. Cool, he said. Robert Louis Stevenson just endorsed me for fiction and editing. Sweet, I said. Chekhov didn't even respond to my friend request. Kind of hurts. I have a little episode where the narrator is down at a shoreline because it takes place on an island. And what I sometimes like doing in my fiction is putting in ideas that sound completely made up, but aren't. And one of the ideas in here about us being composed of stars, if you believe that, then it's demonstrable. It's demonstrably true to say that your left hand and your right hand are composed of molecules from different stars, which is quite an amazing thought. Anyway, so narrator's down at the shore. I picked up a stone and asked whether it and I had indeed begun our lives in exploding stars, and if the stone had been sitting by the shore for centuries, waiting for me to pick it up, because frankly, I knew I wasn't going to do anything exciting with it. And also, was it true the air molecules I was breathing were the same ones inhaled and exhaled by Alexander the Great, and Julius Caesar, and Dante, and Dan Brown? The stone did not respond, or at least I don't think it did, but I imagined it, answering quietly, telling me that my left hand and my right hand are made up of atoms from different stars. And I looked this up in a library book later and discovered that theoretical physics did indeed affirm the awesomeness. I gazed at whitening clouds meandering overhead, teasing images slowly ricocheting into infinity, and I tried hard not to doubt myself. I lobbed the stone up away into the sky. If we're stardust, who rekindles us? Splash. So sometimes in my writing, whether it's a poem or a novel, what I'm trying to do is bring to life moments of, I don't want to say epiphany, it's probably too grand a word, but moments where there's a kind of almost wordless clarity, and then the challenge is to put that into words, which are not the experience itself. But if you can try and recreate that experience, or create it, because there was really a talking alpaca, that's the goal as a writer, is to move, emotionally engage the reader and stimulate their mind. Any other questions, comments?
Obviously with the alpaca, like the discrimination there, it could be parallel with a lot of different groups. Was there a specific conflict that you had in mind when you wrote it? Or was it meant to be a general oppression of any minority group, sort of?
Yeah, I will answer that question. I could give some kind of vague sort of, people have had different interpretations, but the one that pleases me most, I think, is when people read the book and say, well, it is applicable to any oppressed group, race, or species. It is kind of, I mean, people can be oppressed in different ways, and I think there are parallels which people can read in. Sometimes, I suppose, in creating a world, you want it to be specific enough that it's true unto itself and true unto the reader, but universal enough that it doesn't feel too niche or insular. And I set this on an unnamed island in an unnamed place. The number of critics who've said set on a Scottish island or set on a Hebridean island is unbelievable. It's incredible. But that's what happens. People always read in their own interpretations. And there's something kind of interesting about that, because no two people read the same book ever. And if you read this book today and you read it a year from today, you won't read the same book. And I quite like that sense of fluidity. But I think it says something about people or peoples who are oppressed generally, I think.
You do also note you chose a gender.
Yeah.
What was thinking behind that?
I just like the name Archie, and I thought Archie the alpaca sounded good. And yeah, I think there's I was conscious of these things. I think there's quite a good balance of male and female writers character in the book.
The second chapter, I think the strong female characters,
Macy
becomes a fisherwoman in a very masculine dominated island.
Yeah.
It was a kind of interesting contrast to the kind of gendered issues.
Yeah, because these are the kind of things you think about a lot, and I'm quite wary of being a kind of white male author. Albeit that I can see oppression in the cultural history of my people, blah, blah, blah. But I'm also mindful that I'm writing from a certain, I suppose, I mean, I don't want to overlook the fact that I've got certain responsibilities and certain privileges, even in the kind of context in which I'm writing. So strong female characters, I think they've been all of my novels, actually. And not as stock characters and not as sounding boards, but actually really powerful female characters in their own right.
Summer and Stella at the end.
Yeah, and Macy herself, and there's quite a few others. I think that's something to be aware of, partly because one of, I think I mentioned earlier on, Robert Louis Stevenson, there's no strong female characters in Jekyll and Hyde, there's none. There's hardly any females at all in it, but those who are not very prominent. One of the authors whom I read as a teenager, who was a Scottish author, and who I thought I liked, and I do like some of his books, a guy called Will Gunn, he's a novelist and short story writer. He wrote one really great novel called The Silver Darlings, and it's classic, it's brilliant. But in quite a few of his novels, the female characters are very, very two-dimensional, cardboard cutouts, and I think that kind of thing nowadays especially is inexcusable. So I do try to write strong female characters. I mean, maybe I just thought if I made him female, it might deflect away from what I was trying to do with the alpacas. I don't know. But if I do a sequel, which I've thought about, there will be strong female alpacas.
Okay, that's super. Many thanks for coming to the tour. What we can do, thank you very much.